Section 3 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Taylor D. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 2, Part 1, James Oliver. James Oliver was born in Roxbyshire, Scotland, August the 28th, 823. He died March the 2nd, 1908. He was the youngest of a brood of 8, 6 boys and 2 girls. He was the last run of shad, to use the phrase of Theodore Parker, who had a similar honor. Just why the youngest should eclipse the rest, as occasionally happens, is explained by Dr. Tilden on the hypothesis that a mother gives this last little surprise party an amount of love and tenderness not vouchsafed the rest. Let the philosophers philosophize. We deal with facts, not theories, and no one will deny that James Oliver was a very potent, human, and stubborn fact. He was Scotch. His father was a shepherd on a landed estate, where the noses of the sheep grew sharp that they might feed between the stones. The family was very poor, but poverty in the old world grows into a habit, and so the Olivers did not suffer. They huddled close for warmth in their little cottage, and were grateful for parage and shelter. In 1830, the oldest boy, John, filled with the spirit of unrest, tied up all of his earthly goods in a red handkerchief and came to America. He found work at $1 a day and wrote glowing letters home of a country where no one picked up faggots for fires, but where forests were actually in the way. He also said he ate at his employer's table, and they had meat 3 times a week. Of course, he had meat 3 times a day, but he didn't want to run the risk of being placed in the Ananias Club by telling the truth. A little later, Andrew and Jane, the next in point of age, came too, and slipped at once into money-making jobs, piling up wealth at the rate of $3 a week. When 3 of a brood have gone from the home nest, they pull hard on the heartstrings of the mother. Women, at the last, have more courage than men, when they have. Partnerships are very seldom equal partnerships. One takes the lead. In this case, the gray mare was the better horse, and James Oliver got his initiative from his mother. "We are all going to America," the mother would say. And then the worthy shepherd man would give 150 reasons why it was impossible. He had become pot-bound. Fear and inertia had him by the foot. He was too old to try to do anything but care for sheep, he pleaded. And persistently, as she knitted furiously, the mother would repeat, "We are all going to America." Little Jamie was 11 years old. He was a swart and sandy little Scot, with freckles, a full moon face, and a head of tousled hair that defied the comb. "We are all going to America," echoed Jamie. "We are going to America to make our fortunes." John, Andrew, and Jane had sent back real money. They must have earned it. All the debts were cleaned up, and the things they had borrowed were returned. The mother took charge and sold all the little surplus belongings, and the day came when they locked the door of the old stone cottage and took the key to the landlord in his big house and left it. They rode away in a kind neighbor's cart, bound for the seacoast. Everybody cried but Jamie. It was glorious to go away. Such wonderful things could be seen all along the route. They took passage in a sailing ship crowded with emigrants. It was a stormy trip. Everybody was sick. Several died, and there were burials at sea, when the plank was tilted and the body slid into the yeasty deep. Jamie got into trouble once by asking how the dead man could ever be found when it came to Judgment Day. And also, the captain got after him with a rope's end because he scrambled upon the quarterdeck when the mate went aft. The disposition to take charge was even then germinating, and he asked more questions than 10 men could answer. Once, when the hatches were battened down and the angry waves washed the deck, and the elder Oliver prophesied that all were soon going to Davy Jones' locker, Jamie reported that the sailors on deck were swearing, and all took courage. The storm blew over, as storms usually do, and the friendly shores of America came in sight. There were prayer meetings on deck, and songs of thanksgiving were sung as the ship tacked slowly up the Narrows. Some of our ancestors landed at Jamestown, some at Plymouth Rock, and some at Castle Garden. If the last named had less to boast of in way of ancestry, they had fewer follies to explain away than either of the others. They may have fallen on their knees, but they did not fall on the Aborigines. They were for the most part friendly, kind, and full of the right spirit, the spirit of helpfulness. At Castle Garden, one man gave Jamie an orange, and another man gave him a kick. He never forgot either, and would undoubtedly have paid both parties back if he had met them in later life. There was a trip to Albany on a steamboat, the first our friends had ever seen. It burned wood and stopped every few miles for fuel. They ate brown bread and oatmeal, and at New York bought some smoked bear's meat and venison. At Albany, an Indian sold them sassafras for tea, also some dried blackberries. It was a regular feast. At Albany, there was a wonderful invention, a railroad. The coaches ran up the hill without horses or an engine, and the father explained that it wasn't a miracle either. A long rope ran around a big wheel at the top of the hill, and there was a car that ran down the hill as another one ran up. The railroad extended to Schenectady, 16 miles away, and the trip was made in less than half a day if the weather was good. There, they transferred to a canal boat. They had no money to pay for a stateroom, and so camped on deck. It was lots of fun. Jamie then and there decided that someday he would be the captain of a fast packet on a raging canal. His fond hope was never realized. After the cooped-up quarters on the ocean, the smoothness and freedom of the Erie Canal were heavenly. They saw birds and squirrels, and once they caught a glimpse of a wolf. At Montezuma, they changed canal boats because the craft they were on went through to Buffalo, and they wished to go up to Geneva, where John, Andrew, and Jane were getting rich. 2 miles out of Geneva, the boat slowed up. A plank was run out, and all went ashore. John worked for a farmer a mile away. They found him, and in the dusty road, another prayer meeting was held, when everybody kneeled and thanked God that the long journey was ended. Paterfamilias had predicted they would never arrive, but he was wrong. The next day, they saw Andrew and Jane, and tears of joy were rained down everybody's back. Now, for the first time, they had plenty to eat. Meat every day, potatoes, onions, and corn on the ear. There is no corn in Scotland, and Jamie thought that corn on the ear was merely a new way of cooking beans. He cleaned off the cob and then sent the stick back to have it refilled. America was a wonderful country, and Brother John had not really told half the truth about it. Jamie got a job at 50 cents a week with board. 50 cents was a great deal more than half a dollar. I guess so. He would have been paid more, only the farmer said he was a greenhorn and couldn't speak English. Jamie inwardly resented and denied both accusations, but kept silent for fear he might lose his job. His only sorrow was that he could see his mother only once a week. His chief care was as to what he should do with his money. In the fall of 1836, there were several Scotch families going from Geneva to the far west, that is to say, Indiana. The Oliver family was induced to go too, because in Indiana, the government was giving away farms to anyone who would live on them and hold them down. They settled first in LaGrange County, and later moved to Mishawaka, St. Joseph County, where Andrew Oliver had taken up his abode. Mishawaka was a thriving little city, made so largely by the fact that iron ore, bog iron, was being found thereabouts. The town was on the St. Joseph River, right on the line of transportation, and boats were poled down and up, clear to Lake Michigan. It was much easier and cheaper to pole a boat than to drive a wagon through the woods and across the muddy prairies. Mishawaka was going to be a great city. Everybody said so. There was a good log schoolhouse at Mishawaka, kept by a worthy man by the name of Merrifield, who knew how to use the birch. Here, James went to school for just one winter. That was his entire schooling, although he was a student and a learner to the day of his death. The elder Oliver fell sick of chills and fever. He sort of languished for the hills of bonny Scotland. He could not adapt himself to pioneer life, and in the fall of 1837 he died. This was the end of a school education for James. He had to go to work earning money. He became the little father of the family, which James J. Hill says is the luckiest thing that can happen to a boy. He hired out for $6 a month, and at the end of every month took $5 home to his mother. Jamie was 14 and could do a man's work at almost anything. "He has a man's appetite, at least," said the farmer's wife, for he took dinner with the man he worked for. He soon proved he could do a man's work, too. This man had a pole boat on the river, and James was given a chance to try his seamanship. He might have settled down for a life as a poleman, but he saw little chance for promotion, and he wanted to work at something that would fit him for a better job. Then the worst about life on the river was that each poleman was paid a portion of his wages in whiskey, and the rivermen seemed intent on drinking the stills dry. James had not only a strong desire to be decent, but liked also to be with decent people. Now, in Mishawaka there were some very fine folks, the family of Joseph Doty, for instance. The Dotys lived in a 2-story house and had a picket fence. James had dug a ditch for Mr. Doty. and split out shingles for a roof for the Doty barn. At such times he got his dinner at Doty's, for it was the rule then that you always had to feed your help, no matter who they were, just as you feed the threshers and harvesters and silo men now. About this time, James began to put bear's grease on his unruly shock of yellow hair and tried to part it and bring it down in a nice smooth pat on the side. That's a sure sign. The few who noticed the change said it was all on account of Susan Doty. Once, when Susan passed the Johnny cake to James, he emptied the whole plate in his lap, to his eternal shame and the joy of the whole town, which soon heard of it through a talkative hired man who was present and laughed uproariously, as hired men are apt to do. James once heard Susan say that she didn't like rivermen, and that is probably the reason James quit the river, but he didn't tell her so. Not then, at least. He got a job in the iron mill and learned to smelt iron, and he became a pretty good molder, too. Then the hard times came on, and the iron mill shut down. But there was a cooper's shop in town, and James was already very handy with a draw shave and getting out staves. Most of the men worked by the day, but he asked to work by the piece. They humored him, and he made over $2 a day. Joseph Doty was a subscriber to Gleason's Pictorial and Godey's Lady Book. They also had bound copies of Poor Richard's Almanac and The Spectator, with nearly 40 other books. James Oliver read them all, with Susan's help. Then something terrible happened. The young folks suddenly discovered that they were very much in love with each other. The Doty family saw it too, and disapproved. The Dotys were English, but as the family had been in America for a century, that made a big difference. Susan was the handsomest and smartest girl in town. Everybody said so. She seemed much older than James Oliver, but the fact was they were of the same age. The Doty family objected to the match, but Doty the elder one day dropped a hint that if young Oliver owned a house to take a wife to, he might consider the matter. The news reached Oliver. He knew of a man who wanted to sell his house, as he was going to move to a town called Fort Dearborn, now known as Chicago, which had recently been incorporated and had nearly 1,000 inhabitants. The house was a well-built cottage, not very large, but big enough for two. It was a slab house, with a mud chimney and a nice floor of pounded blue clay. It had 2 rooms, a cupboard across the corner, a loft to store things in, and 40 wooden pegs to hang things on. Oliver offered the man $18 for the mansion, cash down. The offer was accepted, the money paid, and the receipt was duly shown to Joseph Doty, Esquire. And so James and Susan were married on May 30th, 1844, and all Mishawaka gave them a shower. To say that they lived happily ever afterward would be trite, but it would also be true. James Oliver was 32 years old before he really struck his pace. He had worked at the cooper's trade, at molding and at farming. His $18 house at Mishawaka had transformed itself into one worth $1,000, fully paid for. The god's half-acre had become a quarter section. His wife had beauty and competence, 2 things which do not always go together. She was industrious, economical, intelligent, and ambitious. She was a helpmeet in all that the word implies. The man whose heart is at rest is the only one who can win. Jealousy gnaws, doubt disrupts, but love and faith mean sanity, strength, usefulness, and length of days. The man who succeeds is the one who is helped by a good woman. 2 children had come to them. They were Joseph D. and Josephine. Napoleon was always a hero to James Oliver. His courage, initiative, and welling sense of power, more than his actual deeds, were the attraction. The Empress Josephine was a better woman than Napoleon was a man, contended Susan. Susan was right, and James acknowledged it, so the girl baby was named Josephine. The boy was named Joseph, in honor of his grandfather Doty, who had passed away, but who, before his passing, had come to see that nature was nearer than he had been. Children should exercise great care in the selection of their parents. Very, very few children are ever dowered with a love that makes for a strength of head, hand, and heart as were these. In 1855, James Oliver was over at South Bend, a town that had started up a few miles down the river from Mishawaka, and accidentally met a man who wanted to sell his 1/4 interest in a foundry. He would sell at absolutely inventory value. They made an inventory, and the 1/4 came to just $88.96. Oliver had $100 in his pocket and paid the man at once. Cast iron plows formed one item of this little foundry's work. Oliver, being a farmer, knew plows, and he knew that there was not a good plow in the world. Where others saw and accepted, he rebelled. He insisted that an approximately perfect plow could be made. He realized that a good plow should stay in the ground without wearing out the man at the handles. The man who hasn't been jerked up astride of the plow handles or been flung into the furrow by a bulky plow has never had his vocabulary tested. Oliver had a theory that the plow should be as light in weight as was consistent with endurance and good work, and that a moldboard should scour so as to turn the soil with a singing sound. Then the share, or cutting edge, must be made separate from the moldboard so as to be easily and cheaply replaced. A plow could be made that needn't be fought to keep it furrow-wise. Without tiring the reader with mechanical details, let the fact be stated that after 12 years of experimenting, planning, dreaming, thinking, working, striving, often perplexed, disappointed, and ridiculed, James Oliver perfected his chilled plow. He had a moldboard nearly as bright as a diamond and about as hard, one that sang at its work. Instead of a dead pull, it sort of sails through the soil, a surprised farmer said. To be exact, it reduced the draft on the team from 20% to 1/2, depending on the nature of the soil. It was the difference between pulling a low-wheeled lumber wagon and riding in a buggy. From this on, the business grew slowly, steadily, surely. James Oliver anticipated that other plow-wise Scot, Andrew Carnegie, who said, "Young man, put all of your eggs in one basket and then watch the basket." On this policy has the Oliver Chilled Plow Works been built up and maintained, until the plant now covers 75 acres, with a floor space of over 30 acres and a capacity of more than 500,000 plows a year. The enterprise supplies bread and butter to more than 20,000 mouths, and is without serious rival in its chosen field. If the horse tribe could speak, it would arise in whinny paeans to the name of Oliver, joining in the chorus of farmers. For a moldboard that always scours gives a peace to a farmer like unto that given to a prima donna by a dress that fits in the back. While James Oliver was not a distinctively religious man, yet many passages of Scripture that he had learned at his mother's knee clung to him through his long life and leaped easily to his tongue. One of his favorite and oft-quoted verses was this from Isaiah, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." The big idea of chilled metal for the moldboard of a plow probably had its germ in the mind of James Oliver from this very passage of Scripture. When Cincinnatus left his plow in the field to go in defense of his country, his excuse was the only one that could pardon such a breach, he once said. Oliver hated war. His bent was for the peaceful arts, for that which would give fruits and flowers and better homes for the people, for love, joy, and all that makes for the good of women and children and those who have lived long. James Oliver loved old people, and he loved children. He realized that the awful burdens and woes of war fall on the innocent and the helpless. And so the business of converting sword metal into plow metal made an appeal to him. Being a metal worker and knowing much of the history of the metals, he knew of the Toledo blade, that secret and marvelous invention with its tremendous strength, keen cutting edge, and lightness. To make a moldboard as finely tempered in its way as a Toledo blade was his ambition. He used to declare that the secret of the sword makers of old Toledo in Spain was his secret too. Whether this was absolutely true is not for us to question. Perhaps a little egotism in a man of this character should be allowable. Cast iron plows, as well as the steel plows of that date, were very heavy, wore out rapidly, the metal being soft, and didn't scour, except in the purer sands and gravels. The share and moldboard quickly accumulated soil, increased the draft, forced the plow out of the ground, destroyed the regularity of the furrows, killed the horses, and ruined the temper of the farmer. Every few minutes the plowman had to scrape off the soil from the moldboard with his boot heel, or stick, or paddle. When a local rival fitted out a plow with a leather pocket tacked onto his plow beam and offered to give a paddle with every plow, James Oliver laughed aloud. "I give no paddles because I do not believe in them, either for punishment or plow use. My plows and my children do not need paddles," was his remark. The one particular thing, the big idea, in the Oliver plow was the chilled moldboard. Chilling the iron by having a compartment of water adjoining the casting clay gives a temper to the metal that can be attained in no other way. To produce a chilled moldboard was the one particular achievement of James Oliver. Others had tried it, but the sudden cooling of the metal had caused the moldboard to warp and lose its shape, and all good plowmen know that a moldboard has to have a form as exact in its way as the back of a violin. Otherwise, it simply pushes its way through the ground, gathering soil and rubbish in front of it until horses, lines, lash, and cuss words drop in despair and give it up. The desirable and necessary thing was to preserve the exact and delicate shape of the moldboard so that it would scour as bright as a new silver dollar in any soil, rolling and tossing the dirt from it. An Oliver moldboard has little checkerboard lines across it. These come from marks in the mold, made to allow the gas to escape when the metal is chilled, and thus all warping and twisting is prevented. Morse, in inventing the telegraph key, worked out his miracle of dot and dash in a single night. The thought came to him that electricity flowed in a continuous current, and that by breaking or intercepting this current, a flash of light could be made or a lever moved. Then, these breaks in the current could stand for letters or words. It was a very simple proposition, so simple that men marveled that no one had ever thought of it before. Watt's discovery of the expansive power of steam was made in watching the cover of his mother's tea kettle vibrate. Gutenberg's invention of printing from movable type, Arkwright with his spinning jenny, and Eli Whitney with his cotton gin worked on mechanical principles that were very simple. After they were explained, exactly so. Oliver's invention was a simple one, but tremendously effective. When we consider that 1/2 of our population is farmers, and that 60% of the annual wealth of the world is the production of men who follow the fresh furrow, we see how mighty and far-reaching is an invention that lightens labor, as this most efficient tool certainly does. Accidentally, I found an interesting item on page 276 of the Senate report of the 45th Congress. Mr. Coffin, statistician, was testifying as an expert on the value of patents to the people. Mr. Coffin says, "My estimate is that for a single year, if all of the farmers in the United States had used the Oliver chilled plows instead of the regular steel or iron plow, the saving in labor would have totaled the sum of $45 million. When the papers announced the passing of James Oliver, some of them stated that he was probably the richest man in Indiana. This fact of itself would not make him worthy of the world's special attention. There are two things we want to know about a very rich man. First, how did he get his wealth? Second, what is he doing with it? But the fact that wealth was not the end or aim of this man, that riches came to him merely as an incident of human service, and that his wealth was used in giving employment to a vast army of workmen, makes the name of Oliver one that merits our remembrance. James Oliver worked for one thing and got another. We lose that for which we clutch. The hot attempt to secure a thing sets in motion an opposition which defeats us. All the beautiful rewards of life come by indirection, and are the incidental results of simply doing our work up to our highest and best. The striker, with a lust for more money and shorter hours, the party who wears the face off the clock, and the man with a continual eye on the pay envelope all have their reward, and it is mighty small. Nemesis with her barrel stave lies in wait for them around the corner. They get what is coming to them. The Oliver fortune is founded on reciprocity. James Oliver was a farmer. In fact, it was the joke of his friends to say that he took as much pride in his farming as in his manufacturing. Mr. Oliver considered himself a farmer, and regarded every farmer as a brother or partner to himself. "I am a partner of the farmer, and the farmer is a partner of nature," he used to say. He always looked forward to the time when he would go back to the farm and earn his living by tilling the soil. He studied the wants of the farmer, knew the value of good roads, of fertilizers and drainage, and would argue long and vigorously as to the saving in plowing with 3 horses instead of 2, or on the use of mules versus horses. He had positive views as to the value of Clydesdales compared with Percherons. So did he love the Clydes that for many years he drove a half-breed, shaggy-legged, and flat-tailed plow horse to a buggy, and used to declare that all a good Clyde really needed was patience and training to make him a racehorse. He used to declare the horse he drove could trot very fast, if I would let him out. Unhappily, he never let him out, but the suspicion was that the speed limit of the honest nag was about 6 miles an hour, with the driver working his passage. Ayrshire cattle always caught his eye, and he would stop farmers in the field and interrogate them as to their success in cattle breeding. When told that his love for Ayrshire cattle was only a prejudice on account of his love for Robert Burns, who was born at Ayr, he would say, "A man's a man for all of that." He declared that great men and great animals always came from the same soil, and where you could produce good horses and cattle, you could grow great men. End of Section 3. Recording by Taylor D. Section 4 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Taylor D. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 2, Part 2, James Oliver. Mr. Oliver loved trees and liked to plant them himself and encouraged boys to plant them. For music he cared little, yet during the 70s and the 80s he had a way of buying Mason and Hamlin organs and sending them as Christmas presents to some of his farmer friends where there were growing girls. A sewing machine, a Mason and Hamlin organ, and an Oliver plow form a trinity of necessities for a farmer, he once said. When Orange Judd first began to issue his Rural American, the enterprise received the hearty interest and support of Mr. Oliver, and he subscribed for hundreds of copies. He thought that farmers should be the most intelligent, the most healthy, and the happiest people on earth. Nothing was too good for a farmer. Your businessmen are only middlemen. The farmer digs his wealth out of the ground, he used to say. He quoted Brigham Young's advice to the Mormons. Raise food products and feed the miners, and you will all get rich. But if you mine for gold and silver, a very few will get rich, and the most of you will die poor. So there is the point. James Oliver was more interested in industrialism than in finance. His interest in humanity arose out of his desire to benefit humanity, and not for a wish to exploit it. If that is not a great lesson for the young, as well as for the old, then write me down as a soused gurnet. The gentle art of four-flushing was absolutely beyond his ken. He was like those South Sea Islanders told of by Robert Louis Stevenson, who didn't know enough to lie until after the missionaries came, when they partially overcame the disability. James Oliver didn't know enough to lie. He knew only one way to do business, and that was the simple, frank, honest, and direct way. The shibboleth of that great New York politician, find your sucker, play your sucker, land your sucker, and then beat it, would have been to him hopeless Choctaw. His ambition was to make a better plow than any other living man could make, and then sell it at a price the farmer could afford to pay. His own personal profit was a secondary matter. In fact, at board meetings, when ways and means were under discussion, he would break in and display a mold board, a coulter, or a new clevis, with a letter from Farmer John Johnson of Jones's Crossroads as to its efficiency. Then, when the board did not wax enthusiastic over his new toy, he would slide out and forget to come back. His heart was set on making a better tool at less expense to the consumer than the world had ever seen. Thus would he lessen labor and increase production. So besides great talent, he had a unique simplicity, which often supplied smiles for his friends. James Oliver had a sort of warm feeling for every man who had ever held the handles of an Oliver plow. He regarded such a one as belonging to the great family of Olivers. He believed that success depended upon supplying a commodity that made the buyer a friend. And heaven, to him, was a vast county fair, largely attended by farmers, where exhibitions of plowing were important items on the program. Streets paved with gold were no lure for him. In various ways he resembled William Morris, who, when asked what was his greatest ambition, answered, "I hope to make a perfect blue," and the dye on his hands attested his endeavors in this line. Both were working men and delighted in the society of toilers. They lived like poor men and wore the garb of mechanics. Neither had any use for the cards, curds, and custards of what is called polite society. They hated hypocrisy, sham, pretense, and scorned the soft, the warm, the pleasant, the luxurious. They liked stormy weather, the sweep of the wind, the splash of the rain, and the creak of cordage. They gloried in difficulties, reveled in the opposition of things, and smiled at the tug of inertia. In their natures was a granitic outcrop that defied failure. It was the Anglo-Saxon, with a goodly cross of the Norse, that gave them this disdain of danger, and made levitation in their natures the supreme thing, not gravitation. The stubbornness of the Scot is an inheritance from his Norse forebears, who discovered America 500 years before Columbus turned the trick. These men were well called the wolves of the sea. About the year 1000, a troop of them sailed up the Seine in their rude but staunch ships. The people on the shore, seeing those strange giants, their yellow hair flying in the wind, called to them, "Where are you from, and who are your masters?" And the defiant answer rang back over the waters, "We are from the round world, and we call no man master." James Oliver called no man master. Yet with him, the violent had given way to the psychic and mental. His battleground was the world of ideas. The love of freedom he imbibed with his mother's milk. It was the thing that prompted their leaving Scotland. James Oliver had the defect of his qualities. He was essentially Cromwellian. He too would have said, "Take away that bauble." He did not look outside of himself for help. Emerson's essay on self-reliance made small impression upon him because he had the thing of which Emerson wrote. His strength came from within, not from without. And it was this dominant note of self-reliance which made him seem indifferent to the strong men of his own town and vicinity. It was not a contempt for strong men. It was only the natural indifference of one who called no man master. He was a big body himself, big in brain, big in initiative, big in self-sufficiency. He could do without men, and there lies the paradox. If you would have friends, you must be able to do without them. James Oliver had a host of personal friends, and he also had a goodly list of enemies, for a man of his temperament does not trim ship. He was a good hater. He hugged his enemies to his heart with hoops of steel, and at times they inspired him as soft and mawkish concession never could. And well could he say, "A little more grape, Captain Bragg." Also, we love him for the enemies he made. He had a beautiful disdain for society in its smart set sense. He used to say, in order to get into heaven, you have to be good and you have to be dead, but in order to get into society, you do not have to be either. Exclusion and caste were abhorrent to him. Oliver gave all, and doing so, he won all in the way of fame and fortune that the world has to offer. He was a full, free, happy, and useful life. Across the sky in letters of light, I would write these words of James Oliver: "To benefit yourself, you must benefit humanity." Zangwill has written it down in a fadeless ink that Scotland has produced three bad things: Scotch humor, Scotch religion, and Scotch whiskey. James Oliver had use for only one of the commodities just named, and that was humor. Through his cosmos ran a silver thread of quiet chuckle that added light to his life and endeared him to thousands. Laughter is the solvent for most of our ills. All of his own personal religion, and he had a deal of it, was never saved up for Sunday. He used it in his business. But James Oliver was a Scotchman, and this being so, the fires of his theological nature were merely banked. When death was at the door, an hour before his passing, this hardy son of heath and heather, of bog and fen and bleak north wind, roused himself from stupor, and in his deep, impressive voice, soon to be stilled forever, startled the attendants with the stern order, "Let us pray!" Then he repeated slowly the Lord's Prayer, and with the word Amen, sank back upon his pillow to arise no more. For the occasional drunken workman, he had terms of pity and sentences of scorn and alternation. At such times the Scotch burr would come to his lips, and the blood of his ancestors would tangle his tongue. One of his clerks once said to me, "As long as Mr. James talks United States, I am not alarmed, but when he begins to roll it out with a burr on his tongue, as if his mouth were full of hot mush, I am scared to death." In 1893, James Oliver spent several months at the Chicago Exposition. He was one of the World's Fair's commissioners. Hundreds of people shook hands with him daily. He was a commanding figure, with personality plus. No one ever asked him, any more than they did old Dr. Johnson, "Sir, are you anybody in particular?" He was somebody in particular, all over and all of the time. That story about how the stevedores on the dock in Liverpool turned and looked at Daniel Webster and said, "There goes the King of America," has been related of James Oliver. He was a commanding figure, with the face and front of a man in whom there was no parley. He was a good man to agree with. In any emergency, even up to his 80th year, he would have at once taken charge of affairs by divine right. His voice was the voice of command. So there at Chicago, he was always the center of an admiring group. He was Exhibit A of the Oliver Plough Works exhibition, and yet he never realized it. One day, when he was in a particularly happy mood, and the Scotch burr was delightfully apparent, as it was when he was either very angry or very happy, an elderly woman pushed her way through the throng, and seizing the hand that ruled the Oliver Plough Works in both of her own, said in ecstatic tones, "Oh, it is such a joy to see you again! 20 years ago I used to hear you preach every Sunday." For once, James Oliver was undone. He hesitated, stammered, and then exclaimed in flat contradiction, "Madam, you never heard me preach!" "Why, aren't you Robert Collier, the Reverend Robert Collier?" "Not I, madam. My name is Oliver, and I make ploughs," was the proud reply. That night Oliver asked his trusted helper, Captain Nicar, this question. "I say, Nicar, who is this man Collier? That woman was the third person within a week who mistook me for that preacher. I don't look like a domine, do I, Captain?" And then Captain Nicar explained what Mr. Oliver had known, but which had temporarily slipped his mind, that Robert Collier was a very great preacher, a Unitarian who had graduated out of orthodoxy and who in his youth had been a blacksmith. Why didn't he stay a blacksmith, if he was a good one, and let it go at that? But this Nicar couldn't answer. However, the very next day Robert Collier came along, piloted by Marshall Field, and Oliver had an opportunity to put the question to the man himself. Robert Collier was much impressed by Mr. Oliver, and Mr. Oliver declared that Mr. Collier was not to blame for his looks, and so they shook hands. Collier was at Chicago to attend the Parliament of Religions. This department of the Great Exposition had not before especially appealed to Oliver. Machinery was his bent. But now he forgot plows long enough to go and hear Robert Collier speak on Why I Am a Unitarian. After the address, Mr. Oliver said to Mr. Collier, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Unitarian." "Had you taken to the pulpit, you would have made a great preacher, Mr. Oliver," said Mr. Collier. "And if you had stuck to your bellows and forge, you might have been a great plough-maker," replied Mr. Oliver. "And it's lucky for me you didn't." "Which is no pleasantry," replied Mr. Collier, "for if I had made ploughs, I should, like you, have made only the best." The Oliver exhibit at the Great Fair was a kind of meeting place for a group of such choice spirits as Philip D. Armour, Sam Allerton, Clark E. Carr, and Joseph Medill. And then David Swing, Robert Collier, Dr. Frank Gonsalves, and Gene Field were all added to the coterie. Gene Field's column of sharps and flats used to get the benefit of the persiflage. Collier and Oliver were born the same year, 1823. Both had the same magnificent health, the same high hopes, and courage that never falters, and either would have succeeded in anything into which he might have turned his energies. Chance made Oliver a mechanic and an inventor. He evolved the industrial side of his nature. Chance also lifted Collier out of a blacksmith shop and tossed him into the pulpit. Collier was born in Yorkshire, but his ancestors were Scotch. Oliver's mother's name was Irving, and the Irvings appear in the Collier pedigree, tracing to Edward Irving, that strong and earnest preacher who played such a part in influencing Tomas the Titan of Ecclefechan. Whether Oliver and Collier ever followed up their spiritual relationship to see whether it was a blood tie, I do not know. Probably not, since both, like all superbly strong men, have a beautiful indifference to climbing genealogical trees. I once heard Robert Collier speak in a sermon of James Oliver as a transplanted thistle evolved into a beautiful flower, and the man of many manly virtues. Seemingly, Mr. Collier was unconscious of the fact that, in describing Mr. Oliver, he was picturing himself. Industry, economy, the love of fresh air, the enjoyment of the early morning, the hatred of laziness, shiftlessness, sharp practice, and all that savors of graft, grab, and get by any means. These characteristics were strong in both. And surely Robert Collier was right. If the world ever produces a race of noble men, that race will be founded on the simple virtues upon which there is neither caveat nor copyright, the virtues possessed by James Oliver in such a rare degree. George H. Daniels of the New York Central Railroad and James Oliver were close personal friends. Both were graduates of the University of Hard Knocks. Both loved their alma mater. When Daniels printed that literary trifle, A Message to Garcia, he sent 5,000 copies to Oliver, who gave one to every man in his factory. Daniels was one of the Illini, and had held the handles of an Oliver plow. He had seen the great business of the Olivers at South Bend evolve. Oliver admired Daniels, as he did any man who could do big things in a big way. Daniels had an exhibition of locomotives and passenger cars at the Chicago Exposition, and personally spent much time there. Among the very interesting items in the New York Capitol Central exhibit was the locomotive that once ran from Albany to Schenectady, when that streak of scrap iron rust, 16 miles long, constituted the whole of the New York Central Railroad. And this locomotive, the DeWitt Clinton, had been the entire motor equipment, save 2 good mules used for switching purposes. It was during the exposition that Oliver incidentally told Daniels about how he had been mistaken for the Reverend Robert Collier. "I can sympathize with you," said Daniels, "for the plague of my life is a preacher who looks like me. Only last week I was stopped in the street by a man who wanted me to go to his house and perform a marriage ceremony." "And you punched the ticket?" asked Oliver. "No, I accepted, and sent for the sky pilot to do the job, and the happy couple never knew of the break. The man who so closely resembled Daniels was the Reverend Dr. Thomas R. Slicer of Buffalo, an eminent clergyman now in New York City. Besides other points of resemblance, the one thing that marked them as twins was a beautiful red chin whisker, about the color of an Irish setter. Once, Daniels challenged the reverend gentleman to toss up to see who should sacrifice the lilacs. Dr. Slicer got tails, but lost his nerve before he reached the barber's, and so still clings to his beauty mark. Dr. Slicer was once going through the Grand Central Station when he was approached by a man who struck him for a pass to Niagara Falls. "I regret," said the preacher, "that I cannot issue you a pass to Niagara Falls. All I can do is give you a pass to paradise." "Which," said Mr. Oliver, when Mr. Daniels told him the story, "which was only a preacher's way of telling the man to go to Hades. You and I, George, express ourselves much more simply." It will not do to make James Oliver out a religious man in a sectarian sense. He did, however, have a great abiding faith in the supreme intelligence in which we are all bathed and of which we are a part. He saw the wisdom and goodness of the Creator on every hand. He loved nature, the birds and the hedgerows and the flowers in the field. He gloried in the sunrise, and probably saw the sunrise more times than any other man in Indiana. "The morning is full of perfume," he used to say. And so it is, but most of us need to be so informed. He believed most of all in his own mission and in his own divinity. Therefore, he prized good health, and looked upon sickness and sick people with a touch of scorn. He reverenced the laws of health as God's laws, and so he would not put an enemy in his mouth to steal away his brains. He used no tobacco, was wedded to the daily cold bath, and was a regular amphibian for splashing. He had a system of calisthenics which he followed as religiously as the Mohammedan prays to the East. The pasteboard proclivity was not one of his accomplishments. But a few months before his death, he was missed one day at the works. His son thought he would drive out to his farm and see if he was there. He was there all right, and had just 127 men, by actual count, digging a ditch and laying out a road. James Oliver wasn't a man given to explanations, apologies, or excuses. His working motto usually was that of the Reverend Dr. Jowett of Balliol. Never explain, never apologize. Get the thing done, and let them howl. But on this occasion, anticipating a gentle reproach from his son for his extravagance, he said, "All right, Joe, all right. You see, I've been postponing this tarnation job for 20 years, and I thought I'd just take hold and clean it up, because I knew you never would." He was let off with a warning, but Joseph had to go behind the barn and laugh. One thing that was as much gratification to Mr. Oliver as making the road was the sense of motion, action, bustle, and doing things. He delighted in looking after a rush job, and often took charge of the boys personally. For the men who made the plows, his regard was as great as for those who used them. He moved among the men as one of them, and while his discipline never relaxed, he was always approachable and ready to advise even with the most lowly. His sense of justice and his consideration are shown in the fact that in all the long years that the Oliver Plow Works existed, it has never once been defended in a lawsuit in its home country, damage or otherwise. Thousands of men have been employed, and accidents have occasionally happened, but the unfortunate man and his family have always been cared for. Indeed, the Olivers carry a pension roll for the benefits of widows, orphans, and old people, the extent of which is known only to the confidential cashier. They do not proclaim their charities with a brass band. James Oliver thought that a man should live so as to be useful all of his days. Getting old was to him a bad habit. He did not believe in retiring from business, either to have a good time or because you were old and bughouse. "Use your faculties and you will keep them," he used to repeat again and again. He agreed with Herbert Spencer that men have softening of the brain because they have failed to use that organ. And certainly he proved his theories, for he himself was sane and sensible to the day of his death. Yet when certain of his helpers, bowed beneath the weight of years and life's vicissitudes, would become weak and needful of care, he would say, "Well, old John has done us good work, and we must look after him." And he did. He would have denied that he was either charitable or philanthropic, but the fact was that the Golden Rule was a part of his business policy, and beneath his brusque outside there beat a very warm and generous heart. When the financial panic of 1893 struck the country, and dealers were canceling their orders and everybody was shortening sail, the Olivers kept right along manufacturing and stored their product. Never have they laid off labor on account of hard times. Never have they even shortened hours or pay. This is a record, I believe, equaled by no big manufacturing concern in America. In October 1907, when workmen were being laid off on every hand, the Olivers simply started in and increased their area for the storage of surplus product. They had faith that the tide would turn, and this faith was founded on the experience of 40 years and more in business. Said James Oliver, "Man's first business was to till the soil. His last business will be to till the soil. I help the farmer to do his work, and for my product there will always be a demand." James Oliver had no fear of death. He had an abiding faith that the power that cared for him here would never desert him there. He looked upon death as being as natural as life, and probably just as good. For the quibbles of theology he had small patience. "Live right here. Wait, and we shall know," he used to say. When his wife died in 1902, he bore the blow like a Spartan. 58 years had they journeyed together. She was a woman of great good sense, and a very handsome woman even in her old age. Her husband had always depended on her, telling her his plans and thus clarifying them in his own mind. They were companions, friends, chums, lovers, man and wife. After her death, he redoubled his activities and fought valiantly to keep from depressing the household with the grief that was gnawing at his heart. A year passed, and one day he said to his son, "Joe, I do miss your mother awfully, but then I'll not have to endure this loneliness forever." And this was as near a sign of weakness as he ever showed. James Oliver was a successful man, but it was not always smooth sailing. In the early days, the plow plant caught fire at night and was absolutely consumed. Returning home at 3 o'clock in the morning, exhausted and with clothing wet and frozen in a sheet of ice, this man, sorely kicked by an unkind fate, turned a chair over on the floor before the fireplace, and reclining on it there with eyes closed, endeavored to forget the trying scenes of the night. Mrs. Oliver had made coffee and prepared a simple breakfast for the tired man. But rest was never for her or her family when there was pressing work demanding attention. "James, why are you wasting time? Drink this coffee, put on these dry clothes, and go at once before daylight and order lumber and bricks so the men can begin at 7 o'clock to rebuild. We have orders to fill." And the man, arousing himself, obeyed the command. At 7 o'clock, the lumber was on the ground, and the men were working at preparing to rebuild. James Oliver was a man of courage, but his patience, persistency, and unfaltering faith were largely the reflection of his wife's soul and brain. When 70 years of age, a neighbor once dropped in for a little visit, and in conversation referred to Mr. Oliver's being a rich man. "Yes," said this kindly old Spartan, "yes, they can say I am rich, but if I didn't have a dollar, I would still be rich. With a wife like that." He pointed to his partner of nearly half a century. Mrs. Oliver smiled and said chidingly, "Now, James." But he continued, "I say, mother, if we did not have a dollar, we could still earn our living with our hands at just plain hard work, couldn't we?" And the old lady, who was really never old, replied, "Yes, James, we could still earn our living with our hands, and we would not be miserable over it either." Near the close of his wonderful career, Pericles said, "I have caused no one to wear crape." The Honorable Marvin Campbell, in a speech at South Bend, once quoted this remark of the man who built the city of Athens and added, "Not only can we pay James Oliver the compliment of saying that he never caused anyone to wear crape, but no one ever lost money by investing in either his goods or his enterprises, and moreover, no one ever associated with him who did not prosper and grow wiser and better through the association." A few weeks before his passing, someone told him this little story of Tolstoy's. A priest, seeing a peasant plowing, approached him and said, "If you knew you were to die tonight, how would you spend the rest of the day?" And the peasant promptly answered, "I would plow." It seems the priest thought the man would answer, "In confession," or "in prayer," or "at church." The priest heard the answer in surprise. He thought a moment, and then replied, "My friend, you have given the wisest answer a man can possibly make, for to plow is to pray, since the prayer of honest labor is always answered." The story impressed Mr. Oliver. He told it to several people, and then made a personal application of it. Thus, "If I knew I were to die tonight, I would make plows today." End of section 4. Recording by Taylor D.